This is a multi-part series of lessons focused mainly on black and white art. But before I get into the practical lessons on rendering, reversals, spotting black and white, I'll be explaining the techniques that are used by artists, specifically in the mediums of comics and illustration, to control the flow, direction, and general pacing in which the reader experiences them. In other words, how comics work on a physiological and psychological level, and also how a cultural bias of the reader can affect that. Understanding these concepts first, before you start putting ink on the page, can affect a lot of decisions on how you compose a scene, how you render, how you represent shadow and light, and how you design and decorate things. Let's start with a quick example of the concept. Frame and focus, using a short video I posted earlier. Focus, or frame. Look at this, and you focus on the white spot in the middle, but add a black spot and that becomes the focus. Add more to surround the white spot to act as a frame to bring the focus back to the center. So before you start spotting black on a page, what do you want the reader's eyes to do? Why does this work? Well, you might be surprised to know that it has a large part to do with our instincts, specifically our instincts in hunting prey. When you first look at a page of comics, there is a lot of information from the entire page hitting you all at once. So how does your brain decide what to look at? Or to put it another way, how does your brain decide what prey to chase down? It's just like when we look at anything in the world. How come we tend to focus on one thing and not everything? Think about if I ask you a question that you don't quite know the answer to, and I give you a choice of 3 items, or I give you a choice of 50 items. Which decision is easier to make? If you don't know the answer to something, the first thing you'll do is eliminate some of the choices, so that you can evaluate the remaining options better. The same thing happens when you are visually trying to make a choice. When you are searching through a scene for something even when you don't know what that thing is, your brain triggers a survival instinct. You become a hunter. Hunting prey is a survival instinct. And because you're putting yourself into that state or survival, your brain is trained to make that decision as fast and easy as possible. Because when you're hungry for something, your brain does not want to waste unnecessary energy and time. So it's going to respond to the visual cues that are the quickest and easiest for your brain to process. Your brain is making a series of decisions to filter out the stuff that it considers unnecessary to make the decision easier. So how does your brain decide how to limit the choices and data that are being perceived all at once? One of the main techniques used to limit the data is to use a frame. Your brain, when it sees a frame, it will focus on what's inside of the frame so that it can eliminate all the data outside of the frame. So when you are looking at something, the first thing your brain eliminates is your peripheral vision, because that is out of focus. So the blurry area that surrounds the center of your vision is the first frame. When looking at a picture or a page of comics, the next frame would be the edge of the page or the literal frame of a picture. Now that your vision has eliminated all the choices outside of the page, the next frame is going to be a panel on the page. So now your brain has eliminated everything except for what's inside the panel, and your brain will continue to search for the next frame so that it can eliminate more data. Now, what constitutes as a frame? Unidentifiable data, pattern breaking and contrast, directional devices, and bridges. Unidentifiable data. These unfocused areas are the equivalent of data that you do not understand, and your brain likes to ignore things that it doesn't understand. Why? Because it takes an extra step to understand them. You'll have to do research, or in this case, you will have to change where your literal focus is. But if you are looking at a still picture or drawing, you don't have that option. There is no way to get a proper clarification of that data. You can stare at the shapes that don't make sense and try to make sense of it using the collective experience and pattern recognition you've acquired over the years. But that is just too much thinking when your brain is hungry for a target. So instead it's going to be drawn to the shapes that you can immediately recognize. Pattern breaking. Humans are built for pattern recognition, almost to a fault. It's why we tend to notice the things that make us different over the things that make us the same. It's why we tend to remember the bad things in our life instead of everything else. It's what makes us afraid to try something new. This could be where you have a bunch of items that are round in shape, and you have one item that is square in shape, you're going to focus on the square item. Or if you have a group of objects that are sitting still, and one that is moving, you'll focus on the one that's moving. If you look at a flock of white and grey sheep, they all tend to blend together, while the few black sheep stand out. In this case, it's the contrast that breaks the pattern. The stuff that's the same or blends together is essentially the baseline pattern that you have established, and it acts just like the unfocused area of your vision, making it more work for you to focus on any of those individual sheep, and instead your eye will be drawn to the black sheep. Another attribute that catches our attention is relative size. We tend to focus on things that are larger than other things for two different reasons. Instinctually, bigger things are more rewarding to identify, either because they have more of something that you want, like meat, or because they are more of a threat. Because you are meat, and in matters of perspective, we tend to focus on the biggest objects first because they are the closest to you, resulting in a bigger threat or bigger bounty. Directional devices. This is data that your brain recognizes and interprets as an instruction, and then uses that instruction to make a decision on what data to eliminate. This is the equivalent of a map, with an arrow pointing to a very specific section. The arrow instructs your brain to ignore anything the arrow isn't pointing at. But directional devices require a little bit of cultural bias. You need to establish what an arrow means in your brain before it becomes useful. A good example of this is if you point at the television with a human. They're going to look at the television because you have established from previous experience that an arrow or pointing finger means to look at where it's pointing. But if you point at a television with a dog, they're most likely going to look at your finger because it is moving and breaking a pattern of non-movement. Bridges. Bridges are a hierarchical pattern that guides you towards something by taking you gradually from a group of data that is less identifiable to one that is more identifiable, bridging two areas gradually. It can use any of the forms of framing that we have discussed before, but it will be a gradual change instead of an abrupt contrast. A good example of this is a scene that has areas that are in complete darkness that slowly become more and more illuminated as they reach the part of the scene that is fully lit. This will push the eye from the part that's in darkness that is harder to recognize toward the part that is in the light and easier to identify. Bridges can also be built through cultural bias. A good example of this is the difference between cultures that read right to left and cultures that read left to right. Reading is a form of data collection. How you read text affects two things. First and foremost, it creates muscle memory in the same direction that you read, and it establishes a cultural bias because your brain recognizes that the part of the page that gives you the least amount of information is the beginning of the page, because you haven't read anything yet. And the part that gives you the most information is the end of the page, because you have finished reading all the data. This is why, if you look at a piece of artwork and you read left to right, the overall movement that guides your eye will start on the upper left-hand corner and be drawn to the bottom right-hand corner, because you have trained your brain to analyze information in this direction. There may be no words on the page, but your brain knows that if it starts in the upper left-hand corner and ends in the bottom right-hand corner, it might have a better chance of understanding what's going on. This is also why, if you are from a culture that is not used to reading right to left, and you are trying to read manga, but you don't read traditionally orientated Japanese on a regular basis, your brain will literally be working against you on every page until you've read enough to retrain it. Right to left reading cultures aren't as affected by this difference in direction since they have had a higher exposure to Western media, publishing and foreign script. Far more, for far longer than your average left to right biased reader. But if the page's focus is ambivalent, or if there are no visual cues, or horizontal writing or foreign glyphs, or some kind of framing, the reader's eyes will always default to whatever their cultural bias is. These are only a few examples, because bridges can use many different concepts to draw your eyes toward a focus, but they are also the weakest form of a frame. Once we've eliminated as much data as possible, what remains becomes our focus. The focus tends to be a single point of data like that black sheep in a flock of grey and white, or it can be a more ambiguous sample of data, like a group of shapes with no definite centre or directional cues. This all happens so fast and regularly that most of the time you may only observe the destination, and not the journey. It is at this point your brain begins the exploration phase, as it further tries to understand the data that it has targeted. This is when you can draw the reader's eye to the next target and move it around the page. We'll talk about the exploration phase in the next episode of Ink Theory, and if you have time, try to identify some of these framing and focus techniques in your favorite comics, black and white art, and photography. Remember, you can start supporting me for as little as $1.11 on my Patreon. Request a commission, buy some original art, or buy some comics and zines by visiting my Ko-Fi shop. And if you like my drawing vids and the occasional tip, don't forget to like, subscribe and comment to get more.